right, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate, and I'm delighted to be here on for a number of levels. For one, it means I'm not in DC today, a very good sign. And for all of the students in the photovoltaics course, I'm going to do my best to disappoint you, because I'm going to talk about solar, but largely in the way that it gets talked about in terms of development and projects, not in terms of the actual content that you guys are supposed to be focused on. And if the projects from past years are any indication of the hype you've already said about these, they're going to be pretty neat. But what I want to do today is to highlight the solar component of what's taking place at the World Bank. And I'll do that for a couple reasons, which I will get to, the most obvious of which is that I'm on leave from Berkeley at the bank, as you heard, but also because what's happening at the bank right now on solar is in many ways a microcosm, in some ways an official microcosm, I'll get to that in a bit, of the whole debate around climate change and implementing new technologies. And for those who are going to leave early or fall asleep, like in my lectures, not in the Jesse's and the classes lectures, but if you're going to fall asleep, the conclusion I'll say right at the beginning, and that is very simple. The community trying to implement clean energy projects at scales from micro solar in households that I'll show you in a bit to the largest solar projects in the world right now are very short on innovative ideas on both the technology side and, unfortunately, also on the financing side. And so there's a remarkable lack of next steps that aren't literally just turn the crank. And so I'm going to disappoint everyone who hears my normal talks about the content of various research projects. I'm really going to focus this on the kind of the more mundane, the practical side of what's happening in terms of investing in clean energy projects and activities. So what I want to start off with is what has been for me the most useful message to tell everyone who I've worked with through the bank. And I'm going to describe that universe a little bit in a second. But it's really that there's a traditional view that the least cost source of energy, i.e. the source of energy, that would be cheapest in terms of new connections to the grid and sustainable or clean energy are in conflict. And I don't think anyone who works at Berkeley on energy issues has to be convinced of that, but I'm going to use that as kind of the fulcrum for debate, because every single discussion one has in the policy process, and I'll come back to the actors in a bit when I put up a slide on some of the bank's interactions and funding issues, comes back to this very issue. And so I'll talk about from very, very small off-grid solar to, again, the world's largest current solar thermal project. And in both of those cases, it is as simple, unfortunately, as show me some clever way to get over the natural bias that all of these fun things we do are much more difficult than investing in coal and buying offsets from some unknown group that has lots of offsets to sell in a transparent, non-fungible way. And unfortunately, that debate, where basically every class at Berkeley starts there and moves on to better stuff in a second, that is really the currency of the debate in terms of doing things on large-scale energy programs, whether you're coming at it from fossil or from the renewable side. I'll highlight this in talking about approaches to some household energy issues where the bank has been doing some very innovative stuff. And I'll talk about it with these large-scale efforts in terms of solar thermal. And then really what I said in the beginning is where I'm going to end up. That the need for new synergies, new ways to engage the private sector, new ways to get innovations from laboratories much more quickly into production, that's really what the international funding community is waiting for. And they're not waiting for it in a very productive way. I'll try to get to them as we go along. And so to start off with, the World Bank, for those of you who haven't sort of studied its guts and details, has around 11,000 employees. It lends on average around $25 billion a year. The energy portfolio is about a quarter of that, a little more than that now, but roughly a quarter of that mixture. And the World Bank's mandate is to address poverty. And so its mission is to address poverty, to address lack of access to resources, energy, and others. And that is the primary mission. Clean energy, sustainable, this and that, are important add-ons that have made real inroads. But that is secondary to basic numbers on access. And unfortunately, when one looks at the access numbers around the planet, you not only see we have over 1 billion people who do not have access to basic electricity services, and another 1 to 2 billion, depending how you count, who have access to electricity, but it's intermittent, it's unreliable, the ways you have to pay for it are incredibly ridiculous and cumbersome. I met with a family in northern Uganda just a month ago, and when they finally got their community hooked up to the grid, I mean, there had been a wire there for a long time, but no electricity to households. There were more solar home systems in the village. By the time this process had ended, then we're going to be hooked up to the grid. I mean, lots of things hadn't worked in terms of electrification. When this finally all happened, and they actually got connections, and of course they started with the businesses in town first, to pay your bill, you had to take a 5-hour bus ride into Kampala to pay your bill, which is a crazy thing, and it comes up over and over again. And so how one provides services is not a very good sign. And in fact, the forecast done by the International Energy Agency is that if we look ahead from now till 2030, the number of people who will get access to new electricity won't change very much. In other words, we will have just about as many unelectrified people in 2030 as today. So that would speak to, at one level, a large-scale failure of efforts to really change the basic picture. And of course, there are lots of programs doing electrification. There's lots of activity going on. But with population growth and with the very slow rate of new electrical connections, largely in peri-urban areas and slums and rural areas, we're not making much progress. So the first statement that almost everyone who comes into work at the US State Department, USAID, the German aid group, GIZ, the British aid group DFID, the World Bank, invariably says, well, okay, the model so far has not worked, therefore we should really upset it and come up with very clever, new, innovative ways to go. And that's almost as far as the conversation goes. There are lots of interesting small examples of doing things differently. There are very few large transformative efforts that have really changed this picture. And again, when you look at this map of where we are expected to be 20 years out, that says some very bad things about our ability to make through public sector money or private sector money this world of energy access change very much. I do most of my work on areas without access in the areas where the access is the most lacking. And then when you look at the numbers for sub-Saharan Africa and for South Asia, that's where the bulk of people who do not have access to electricity live in terms of numbers. Now that doesn't mean people living in North Africa and the Middle East and parts of Latin America have high quality service, but in terms of the raw numbers of connections, you're really talking about first electrification in much of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and in Africa. And you're talking about changing dramatically how electricity is provided to those who nominally have a connection in much of the rest of the world. So just kind of to orient the picture of where we are in this process. And I'm going to start with a story on cook stoves, not to divert too far away from photovoltaics, but I want to highlight something which comes up over and over again as a basic energy need for many of these people, and a place where finally an interesting cooperation has happened. And I'll describe that, and I'll refer back to it a couple of times thinking about some solar efforts. So this is a graph put together by one of my oldest colleagues at the World Bank, someone I've worked with for 20 years, way before obviously I got to the bank, but also a Berkeley graduate student, and she's graduated now, but I listed her still from her graduate days. She did this work while she was finishing up her PhD. And I want to highlight something that ties together basic household energy, electrification, and will lead us into discussions about solar photovoltaics in a little bit as well. So this is a snapshot of Dar es Salaam, 1990, showing the least cost form of cooking. And at that time, electricity was the least cost form, obviously, for those who had connections. This is in Dar, where the connection rate in the urban area is relatively good. It's very poor. It's about 19% countrywide. It's over 70% in Dar es Salaam itself. And electricity was the least cost form of cooking. In fact, many people cooked with electricity. As part of the wave of privatization that hit many of the countries in South Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa between 1990 and today, Utilities were privatized at the fastest rate in these regions than anywhere else in the world. Tanzania is no exception. Their utility, the generation pieces and some of the bill collection, not the whole thing, it's a very bizarre story, was sold to a holding company in South Africa, which looked at the issue in Tanzania and said, well, your problem here is that your rates are too low. You're not collecting enough revenue, so therefore raising your rates is the obvious way to go as opposed to making the system work better and other things you might do. So they promptly raised the rates, and what happened was electricity was no longer the least cost form of cooking. In fact, traditional fuels that had been leaving the household sector in Dar es Salaam ramped up. And this is not uncommon. I'm using this example because we have good data, but the story is relatively common. And so least cost cooking with unimproved stoves, traditional cook stoves, and improved cook stoves, where available, ramped up quite dramatically in use. But what it also meant is that Tanzania is one of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa that mines and exports coal. And so families not only cook with wood and dung, but also with coal. And so health issues, we can track, unfortunately, pneumonia and a variety of illnesses increasing. But what you see here is exactly the opposite of the transition that we all talk about. Moving towards cleaner fuels, ideally low expensive electrification, some use of kerosene and other fuels as well, is supposed to be the transition we're looking at. But in fact, in many parts of the world, we've actually seen the reverse trend. And so it's a very worrying starting point in terms of how good have been programs to work with utilities, to build mini-grids, to build the different technologies that might give you the opportunity to, again, move towards cleaner forms of cooking. And I'll come back to this because many of the lessons that the last 20 years of efforts on improved cook stoves, and those of you who have worked with either myself or Kirk Smith here or Shaw Gadgil, a number of people on campus who have worked on cook stove issues, have put huge amounts of effort into individually very interesting projects. I've done long-term studies in East Africa. Ashok has worked in a number of places, including in Sudan. Kirk has worked in Guatemala and India, etc. There's been lots of very interesting lessons learned, and most of the international funding agencies over the last decade stopped working on stoves. This area has actually fallen off the radar screen despite Berkeley is a unique place where this is talked about in many courses and is a big issue. Most of the world's dropped off the radar screen. In the last 2 years, that has turned around, and it's turned around in an interesting way to think about for those of you interested in research, academic research side, business side, or the public sector approach to problems. What happened wasn't the big multinational agencies, again, groups like the World Bank or the national development agencies, building huge coherent programs on household energy and stoves. What happened is the United Nations Foundation got organized around this issue, drew in much of this pre-existing community, but also drew in the world of private sector groups, of national aid agencies. Now there is a very new, a year and a half, 2 years old, record size, this is about $70 million operation, thinking about learning the lessons from cook stoves, finding ways to work with entrepreneurs, bringing technologies much more rapidly from research labs, for example, the ones here, into the market. And it's a process that 5 years ago everyone said it's not possible for kind of a foundation-based group to be the driver of this. So when people argued about it, the example that was brought up of a place where foundation work really made a huge difference was actually at the beginning of the Green Revolution, where foundations were the groups that supported the growth. Some people will argue that that foundation-based growth evolved towards basically a big ad campaign for some of the big agrochemical companies, and it evolved to be a very different thing than the initial formation. But foundations took the lead in pulling all the actors together in working through the process to dramatically innovate around household foodstuffs, efficiency of bringing foods to market. And so there is an interesting precedent which had largely been forgotten. And so again, right now for the people here thinking about household energy, often with a start on stoves, but not only on stoves. There's a very interesting new consortium that is built up. Many different groups are now playing into it, and it has finally brought kind of a different sets of perspectives on solar as well, and I'll get to those in a second. So this has been a real change in the process. What we have seen on the stove side is the number of groups that are not only doing stove research, taking efforts, for example, the kinds of things that we did here at Berkeley with support from the Blum Center, working with artisans, working with vendors, bringing a whole range of products to consumers. You now see an effort around stoves that has many of the features that have been talked about for 25, 30 years, and that is diversity of local production, commercial groups competing to be the lead agencies in the market, and over the past year, some of the biggest multinational groups that had talked about stoves for a long time, including the World Bank, that's been one of the largest funders on this, the German aid agencies, the British, etc., have now all gotten much more not only coordinated internally, but coordinated in these bigger communities around getting innovations out to the market. And again, this is an area that huge interest at Berkeley, but almost unheard of in many other places. And so it serves as an interesting example for what might go on in terms of electrification, and in particular things I'll talk to as we go ahead in solar. And I'll skip that story for a bit. So let me now give a few minute preface on the World Bank's energy lending, and then we'll talk largely about solar aspects. And again, I'll refer back to this learning wave and then commercialization and now this coordination wave we've seen on household energy and stoves, because it really does provide some important models. So if I just plot out the World Bank's lending in the energy sector going back not quite a decade, the counting schemes changed a little bit before 2003. There's a couple things to note on here. One is we'll start at kind of some of at the classic areas. So thermal generation right here. The second from the top, you'll notice that it has been some fluctuations, but on the order of a couple $100 million up until this past year, and I'll just flash the numbers and I'll go back and forth a bit. Thermal generation, right here, I see I was covering the end of it. 500 million, 100 million, 500 million, up until 2010, when the bank made perhaps its most controversial loan ever. And this is for a 4 gigawatt coal plant in South Africa. This is the so-called Medupi plant. So again, if you take this out, you get a very different perspective on the amount of coal-fired lending the bank has done. And I'll come back and talk about this particular loan a couple times as we go. But if I go back and sort of look at the overall trends, the bank has ramped up quite dramatically its investment in energy efficiency. It's become one of the largest sectors of lending. Large hydro, which was very large in the 60s and 70s, got squeezed down. There was a project in Vietnam that was put in and is low and is quite low again now. Renewable energy has grown essentially commensurate with the growth in energy efficiency. Oil and gas on the upstream production side also is a very large part of the lending. This is largely at the private sector wing of the World Bank. This is called International Finance Corporation. And then the thermal lending, and again, you can either include in one thinking or remove in terms of the trend, the South Africa plant, and then transmission distribution, which has also been a large sector. So I'll put the numbers up for those who read it more easily in terms of the charts. Well, I'm just going to highlight that the total energy lending in all the areas, if we total up all the sectors to back to 2003, is about $44 billion, so a huge amount of money. And again, if we look at the areas of efficiency, large hydropower, about half the size of efficiency, renewables, very, very significant, upstream oil and gas, also very significant. Policy has been a strong piece, and this is largely the work I'll describe going forward in terms of low carbon development. And then again, you can see the lending with or without the Medupi coal plant. And I'll come back to that one in a second. So this gives you kind of a picture of where the lending has gone. The bank right now is writing its energy strategy for the next 10 years. That's in fact why I'm at the bank right now, to be engaged in that process. The strategy right now is at the board of the bank, and so to orient people, The World Bank has 26 seats on its board. They are divided equally between industrialized and developing countries, or the bank uses the nomenclature of the climate process, so-called Part 1, industrialized nations, Part 2, and then middle income and then poorest nations, so-called IDA or Part 3 countries. And the board is balanced between those two halves. And what that means is that essentially discussions about individual projects and about policy play out the so far unsuccessful international negotiations, the successor to the Kyoto Protocol. So we see in the discussion of each project essentially the same positions in the same debate. Those of you who want to see it, the World Bank's draft energy strategy was leaked, and so you can find it on any of the the sort of Energy and Environment Wire. If you go to any of those, you'll see the whole document. And it calls for the bank to do some things quite differently, and I'll go back to this graph to describe it. What this strategy, which is again in draft and is being debated by the bank's board and hence by the nations involved in the process, calls for categorizing lending no longer simply by saying there are renewable lending categories, the renewables and efficiency, but it calls for the bank to do life cycle greenhouse gas analysis for all of its energy projects. Doesn't set a price on carbon, but it calls for life cycle analysis for everything the bank does. And what that means, of course, is that it highlights the carbon impacts of coal projects, thermal projects, and it takes what had previously been called oil and gas and now divides it up based on life cycle analysis. And so Marcellus and fracking shale will be in a very different category than some of the cleanest forms of natural gas. So it takes the debate that has been going on internationally about how we should do carbon accounting, and it puts it into the single largest multinational lending agency in terms of its daily operations. This has been very contentious in the debate going on within the bank. And what the strategy also calls for is that the bank will no longer lend to middle-income countries for coal. It will lend for coal for the poorest nations. And this is a place where the environmental groups are strongly in disagreement with the draft strategy, where many of the groups have called for no lending for coal at all anymore. But what this strategy does is it essentially argues that the bank should step out of lending for coal for all middle-income countries and only reserve that for the poorest countries on the planet. This has been very, very contentious at the board. The areas where there has not been much debate has been in the agreement that efficiency is going to need to be ramped up. And while the lending portfolio has grown dramatically, doing efficiency at the scale of lending we're talking about here has proven remarkably difficult. Critics of the bank will say, well, this is because the bank hasn't found the right ways to lend for efficiency. Critics of what I would call the California approach, saying efficiency pays for itself, the $20 bills that you should find on the ground, will say that may be true, but finding ways to aggregate and to monetize and to scale up those efficiency loans and to find the upfront capital to pay for things that we know should work down the line have been challenging. And so this is where the debate rages right now in terms of how one should structure the lending portfolio overall. When you add up the bank's lending today and you make the following division, coal-fired, diesel-fired, and gas-fired power plants are in one category. So again, not doing the carbon accounting yet, but fossil-based generation is in one category. And renewables and efficiency, policy loans, because most of the policy money is in terms of more sustainable energy plans, and then transmission, and I'll come back to that one, are in the non-fossil category. The non-fossil area is about 65% of the bank's lending, and this proposal calls for that to go to 3/4 of the lending over 3 years. So it moves along fairly significantly in terms of how multinational agencies work lending, but I want to highlight the transmission part of the story, and this is not something unique to the World Bank. So I've just lumped everything that was not fossil generation fossil generation and upstream oil and gas recovery, I should have said that, into the non-fossil category. How do you take into account transmission in terms of thinking about the portfolio? Do you say the mix, let's say we have a $1 billion transmission project. Do we assign that to be between fossil and renewables based exactly on the fossil renewables mix on the lines today? Do we say that it's based on what comes true so we don't do the accounting for a couple years afterwards? Do you have some metric that examines what is the policy goal of a country and you weight the mixture of how you assign that transmission project in terms of renewables or fossil based on some aspirational goal? Right now, not only the bank, but all of the national lending agencies are struggling with this, and not just in a kind of a simple accounting way. They're trying to figure out how, when you put together loan packages of this scale, do you account for these projects? Some are very easy. I'll talk in the end of the lecture today about the current plan for the world's largest solar plant, which the World Bank, the Arab Fund, and the European Union are funding in Morocco. And that's an effort that starts off with a relatively modest, not small, but modest, 170 megawatt solar thermal plant in the desert, and scales over 10 years to 2 gigawatts of solar thermal. For that project, the transmission line that you build to it is quite unambiguous. That transmission goes to a solar thermal project in the desert. One can easily assign that into the green category. What do you do in terms of urban upgrades? What do you do in terms of areas where the mix of renewables and gas on the lines aren't clear? Do we simply leave this out of the portfolio? How does one use the lever of significant transmission lending to both meet basic energy needs and also to try to encourage countries to sort of lean or step forward in terms of greener portfolios? The policy piece has been relatively easy and straightforward because much of the policy lending has focused on efforts to work with countries to develop low-carbon strategies for the reason I mentioned at the very beginning, that the growing data exists, that a range of opportunities are out there to both invest in energy efficiency and renewables, increase access to it at low cost. And I'll show you a couple of the standard slides for that in a second. But I wanted to highlight that as we began the process. The types of projects I'm mentioning range from the one I just highlighted, this effort in Morocco, which is starting off with, I said 500 megawatts here, but it's really 170 megawatts, and then another 340 megawatts in phase 1 and phase 2 to build out this very large solar thermal plant. Again, 2 gigawatts are planned in this overall project. The cost per kilowatt hour right now to build this out is estimated to be, almost 30 cents a kilowatt hour. China has just announced that its first 3 solar thermal plants should come in at around 16 cents a kilowatt hour. And there's been a debate about the cost numbers, particularly in China relative to other places in the world. The solar thermal numbers from Morocco are high, but they're not out of bounds of some of the projects that we've seen. And so again, we're talking about very high cost renewable generation relative to some of the some of the fossil fuel alternatives. In Bangladesh, there's been an effort which has been quite successful so far to put 1 million solar lanterns and solar electrified households in place. Mexico has, essentially in the run-up to the climate conference in Cancun this past year, has initiated a number of projects, state-by-state energy efficiency efforts, very large-scale programs to do low-carbon transportation. It's been a real success story. I'll skip this particular story about carbon credits. It is true, but what's even more interesting in Kenya is that it has been one of 15 or 20 countries that have highlighted using those policy loans from the World Bank and from the UK aid and other governments that have assisted them to work through the policy process, to do something very similar to what California's done with a low-carbon plan, various strategies within sectors. In fact, Kenya adopted 2 years ago a feed-in tariff. They've adjusted it twice. They have upped the benefit to installing wind farms, to the detriment of the people in the biofuel sector that think they're being discriminated against. Kenya has great wind and biofuel resources. So far, the wind lobby is winning, but this has been a very innovative process. Turkey has been a big chunk of this year, last year's lending number. It's actually half here and half here. Turkey's done about $1 billion transmission upgrade program with the bank, largely to hook in very large new wind farms and to engage in building efficiency on the commercial side. And the area where the bank has ramped up quite dramatically in the last 3 years has been lending for not only individual countries' transmission, but also for regional transmission projects. There's a Central American effort, there's a new East African effort that's coming up, and all of these have been built around these low-carbon individual country portfolios. I'll skip that one. I'll say a few minutes on the lighting aspect, again, because it follows so much in terms of what we've seen with this prior story on cooking. Traditional lighting in Kenya still has a typically sub-Saharan African very, very low electrification rate. So lighting access, paraffin, candles, a little bit of solar we'll describe in a second. And what's happened over the last few years, building almost entirely on a project that was started at UC Berkeley and at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, was to recognize that not only were solar home systems a technology, which I've spoken to many of you about in the past, a very growing area, but so are even smaller solar lanterns. And the idea was to focus on very little bits of solar-powered lighting initially, and then grow the market outwards. And this has been an area which really has ramped up rapidly. So those of you who work with Evan Mills on the Lumina project, that's one of the precursors to what was called Lighting Africa. Now it's called Lighting Development because it's spreading beyond Africa now. And it's an effort that has focused on getting into the shelves of stores really small. That's the entire thing. Solar lantern, panel in there, and I'll get to a few other details in a second. Whoops, that one's out of order. What has happened in partnership with large and small companies, a wide range of very, very small lanterns have now come aggressively into the market. This is a program that, again, was based on work on optimizing small photovoltaic systems, LED lanterns, and figuring out what worked in a variety of business environments. And I highlighted Philips, as you can see, has a whole range of products in this market. Here's another company, D-Light. I'm less a fan of D-Light. This particular product is not one of my favorites. But they also have done this with a diverse range of direct solar charged features. Sorry, I think I put them this way unintentionally out of order. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry, I dropped them out of order by accident there. So among these sorts of products, we're talking, this is the very small, couple watt solar panels, LED lighting systems, and in terms of what's going to sound on the research side like an incredibly boring lack of an innovation, that had a huge effect in terms of how exciting this was to end users, how exciting this was to companies, is the following. Most of the work that had gone on solar lanterns was essentially waiting and pushing for LED light prices to come down enough, optimizing very low cost but rugged individual systems. But I pulled out of each of these boxes the thing that made these two products best sellers. What are they? Exactly. Right. The thing that had the single biggest change in the demand for these products and in the excitement of companies to sell them wasn't actually the lighting. People expected the lighting to work. This is about a 12 US dollar unit. This is about a 26 US dollar overall unit. It was the ability to charge your cell phones with them. Had the single largest effect on this. I just put some pictures with the lights on just to give you a feeling, low setting, high setting in terms of the bulbs. But literally the process that came out of an incredibly sort of boring, mundane, non-science-based effort to diversify what the lanterns have done has made the most impact. Now what we're seeing is kind of an expansion outward. So cell phone charging was first, then it was having the lowest cost radios built into these as the next item. Then it was having small amounts of rapid charging so that you can plug in, you could juice up your cell phone rapidly. So you could do a rapid spot charge as well. These are the kinds of things that, again, in the last 2 or 3 years have totally transformed the interest on the lending side and on the doing side of these types of projects. This made an overnight difference. We have whole factories in China and Malaysia who have ramped up only to meet the demand for these small scale panels. And so again, it's a very different picture than the one that I had worked on for quite a while. And that's a story that, again, I've told in detail to some of the audience here before. And it's the story that I won't review fully but it's the story of much larger systems. So here's a woman holding a 14-watt amorphous panel. These are the panels that during the 90s ramped up dramatically their sales in East Africa. There's an important story about providing information on the quality of panels. We essentially, in conjunction with a number of NGO groups and one for-profit group, became sort of a consumer reports on the quality of the panels in Kenya. It had a dramatic effect. We drove out of the market a poorly performing company and panel. They came back with a better product more recently. Another bad actor has entered the market more recently, and someone else is working to drive them out of the market. So we have played a role to get 40-watt, 40-watt panels in place. And again, the ones I was showing you with those off-grid, very small scales, these are just a couple watt systems. So we're looking even smaller scale ones have made it into the market. And again, these are just ads from the Kenyan newspapers showing people advertising, if you have these solar panels, you can watch your favorite soap opera, you can watch the World Cup. I mean, this has been a driver on the commercial side, but it's this new push into these really small lighting systems that have had the biggest effect in terms of bringing basic services to new households. Now, I want to get back to one of the basic numbers. So I won't quite end with this, but I'm going to sort of use it to wrap up a little bit of the discussion. That's the following. Does this count as electrification or not? Right? This is not such a, not that one does, but do these sorts of things count as electrification? They certainly count as electrical services. You get some lighting, you get these bits of service. But certainly, when I started off the talk and said, we do not see yet, in terms of the international projections, huge change in the people who are getting real modern access to services. Certainly, these are useful. I am keen on them, and the growth in this area has brought a whole range of services to individuals. Has it, at the same time, brought a new appreciation of the kind of thing that gets worked on here, and that is the centralized grid model a better one to push in many of these areas than microgrids and mini-grids and systems that tie in local resources? Is this a prelude to electrification? And what we don't know yet is, will either of these kind of paths we're describing really work? But by that, what I mean is that the excitement around solar now has been around growing the thing that we often say, right? People care about services, not about how many kilowatts or megawatts you have on the roof. This is really about bringing the specific service, lighting, cell phone charging, directly to people's doors. The next stage of the process, and the one where basic research on low-cost solar materials, energy storage, ways to integrate services from radios and lighting and ability to do all manner of things, connecting the very simplest laptops directly into these, all of those types of energy services are what people would ask for. And the question that is totally unresolved at the multinational lending agencies is which of these approaches to push, including which of the hybrids to push. All of that transmission and distribution funding I mentioned was all traditional. None of it was funding for mini-grids, microgrids, growing regional grids and connecting them together, tying in biofuel resources, small-scale hydro, solar. It was all traditional electrification, big transmission lines going from power plants, whether they're coal plants or whether they're this big new solar plant in Morocco or this very large new wind farm going into northern Kenya, etc. It's this amorphous interface that is probably the place where the most opportunity is for innovations from companies, from universities, to really change not only how we provide services, but also how sustainably we provide them. And this, again, is an area where the types of projects that the course is doing are right exactly in the sweet spot. And it's amazing how little thinking about this exists right now in terms of the agencies with literally tens to hundreds of billions to spend on these kinds of projects. So let me conclude with a little bit, we're going to skip those, on what I highlighted in the very beginning was what I think is the biggest opportunity. Yes, that was Christian. We flashed by there in a second. Well, okay. And that is what I think is right now the biggest opportunity to change this whole game. Meaning I don't yet know the answer in terms of large grid, small grid, mini grid, some mixture. But there is another model that's been emerging, and it's got some challenges, but it's exactly where we are seeing the most activity. And so I'm highlighting here, this is an effort, this is Christian Casillas, a grad student here in ERG at Berkeley, working in a community on the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua. This is a paper that we published just back in November. And what he's been doing is educating the community members around energy efficiency. You can see right down here, he's talking about CFLs versus regular light bulbs. And what his project was on the community scale. This is 2,000 people formerly living off-grid in a community where a NGO that got its start in Berkeley worked with that community. It's called Blue Energy. And they worked initially on local mini-grid electrification and then on small-scale wind turbines. And what this evolved into was an effort to work through a whole range of what are called Vattenfall curves, McKenzie curves, marginal abatement curves. There's many names for them. And it's essentially an energy service and financial and carbon impact curve. And so what was discovered in this community, where there was no metering initially, was simply installing meters, in particular for the two largest commercial users of energy in the community, but also in households, that installing meters, something that the government in Managua decided to do, that one could not only save on energy, but one could also do it at a cost savings, installing CFLs, more effective lighting, biogas systems, again, making the generator better tailored to the size of the loads once you reduce the load overall, wind turbines, solar, etc., allowed this community to essentially go no carbon. So it allowed them to save more than their sum total use before. So this is an example at the very smallest scale of not a marching order of you must do this first, that second, that third, but of a menu of technology and policy options that made a difference in the community. The bank has been involved with a number of countries in doing exactly the same kind of thing. Again, this is building one of these carbon abatement curves. For Mexico, this was brought out before the Cancun summit. Mexico utilized this to then prioritize some of the efforts. You see the bus system optimization, a number of transport building efficiency options came in as technologies that saved on carbon, that did so at a negative cost. And then you go to options that, again, would be low carbon options that then begin to get into some more standard category of positive costs. So again, a number of these sorts of pictures. The process really began with an effort done by the Swedish utility Vattenfall. They hired the McKinsey group to do a global version of the same thing. And again, the same sort of picture with energy efficiency, highlighting the negative costs if you do it right. And I say negative costs in terms of life cycle cost for the overall project. You obviously, in many cases, need upfront funding to make it happen. That's precisely where groups like the World Bank that have upfront funding and are looking for good things to do, we'd like to think, can find ways to provide that money upfront to really begin this sort of overall process. And I highlight this, and I'm going to go back to the smallest, village scale one to start, because this sort of operation really embodies much of what has been the kind of the California story on energy, and that is that efficiency works. We have lots of examples here that it works, but we have to plan for it. The biggest piece of all of these programs, and right now, not only is there these curves done for Brazil, several provinces in China, Mexico, Mali, Nigeria, a whole number of places have been investing in, instead of building out these menus of options, it has been the planning, the assessment side, whether that means work on policy, whether that means work on finding ways to make this process of bringing meters in a commercial operation, whether it means focusing on transportation. All of it has been an effort that has required the kind of systems thinking that academics involved in energy like to say that they do, and that largely these multinational agencies are not yet either doing or good at, and I would argue from my experience so far, in many of them, that is in fact true. The opportunities to make these things happen are there. The knowledge at the project level is there. The ability to build out capacity so that country after country can do least cost planning around electricity or transport, or what are the opportunities to incentivize green buildings. All of those options are there, and many of you research them right now. Much of those stories remain theoretical for these funding agencies. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that what I've mainly done is highlight the need for groups like this, but also the need for the engagement, because many of the things I've described here were old hat to some or all of you, but these are not old hat to the process of putting them into development planning. And so what I'm hoping that we will see is that many more of the kinds of things that you're all working on here, you find the opportunity, whether it's yourself or through colleagues, to get those stories and how those stories might scale up into the hands of people who make the sort of decisions I highlighted in the beginning, where, again, just the World Bank alone, $44 billion of lending in this area in the last 8 years. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to do questions. Do you want to do 5 or 10 and then do the reception?
Sure,
So,
sounds good. So
okay.
do we have microphones, guys, or do you want to, Mateo, do you know?
No, we don't have.
All right, so just raise your hands and
then we can repeat the question.
I'll just repeat it into here. Okay.
Okay, I'm Mitchell from Natural Innovation, and I work on innovation in developing countries. And I would go back to one of the first points you made about the lack of innovation in this space. And I would agree with you and suggest that it's primarily to do with the lack of money in it. And the lack of money is there because it's very hard to make a profit off of people who earn $3 a day.
Yeah.
I mean, where I see the innovation is directly related to that. It's in radical cost reductions, for example, and not just the product, but also the business models. Those lights succeeded in part because they radically improved the business models as well as the product and reduced the markups in the supply chain. And also in huge differences in efficiency through using the energy in shorter pathways. For example, using solar thermal for pumping or solar thermal for cooling.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the easiest answer is I agree. I agree that we're not doing innovation in the places that directly affect these communities. I mean, the way I've said it in many of my classes is that the most standard statement is that we, whoever we are, do not innovate for they. You innovate for yourself, and then if it happens to trickle to they, so be it, or maybe even you oppose it. But not only is there not money there, but the recognition of the opportunities to do this differently is not there. Now, one of the most interesting statements that you now hear, very different than the R&D model that we talk about in the US and Europe and Japan, is that most innovation we see right now in the energy area is not happening in the lab. Now, I don't mean labs aren't important, but what I mean is that what we're seeing now is a very different flavor. The project in Morocco, again, its overall plan is 2 gigawatts of solar thermal, and they are certainly launching phase 1. Who knows how many of the later phases will get built. They are counting on a learning by doing in terms of the manufacturing to drive down the cost much more rapidly than we traditionally saw. I don't just mean faster than the learning curve. They mean in the same factory, the same mirrors they make in July, they expect to be less costly than the ones they were made in January. So they expect incredibly rapid in-house learning in a very practical way. And it's not one that cuts the universities out of the equation. It's one where those people wanting to do research on this area need to think very differently about the mixture of stuff you do purely in the lab and in a more, I don't want to say practical setting, but in a manufacturing setting. This is certainly part of the standard argument about China, but I'm not going to get into the full China story because I think it's much more complicated than just that. But I do agree that we are not yet finding out the business models that make the energy services more attractive, that allow us to use this. $44 billion is a lot of money, but to use it to do dramatically different things in this area. That is missing from this story so far.
Hi, Dan. I just got back from selling D-Lights in India.
Okay.
And I have to say the one that you hated is our top seller.
And I'm still surprised. I'll go to the picture of it. Yep.
It is so cheap.
Yes, it is a conical little one. It looks like an insect trap. I'll try to find the picture and put it up as we go. But okay,
But
keep going.
we were imitating the business model, not we were buying them from you. But
That's this one we're talking about here. So the solar panel, that's it.
if you're
It's a can, basically, with a light underneath, and you put it next to you. It's the one, by the way. So maybe this is an example. So this is the one that I have found does not produce the kind of light shown in this picture.
I think you're right. And if I hadn't dropped out of your class, I'd probably sell it better.
But that's the point. The point is it's the fastest seller, right? This is, by the way, so one last thing to sort of, add to before your comment. This is the one of the lights I've shown that was not certified by the groups that are certifying these lanterns. Now you can either say that this international group trying to certify the lights is protecting the customers, or we got it wrong, because if that's the fastest seller and it's the only one that was not certified, that says something interesting about
what you can do
the
with
product.
Well, I can tell you what's wrong with that lantern. It was made by Berkeley, Stanford, not my question is not for myself. Jigar Shah, the founder of Sun Edison, was following my Twitter feed as I was tweeting your talk, and he asked a question for you.
Tell my Jigar I said hi.
All right. He says, do you agree with the Bloomberg New Energy Finance's prediction of $1.45 per watt in 2020 for utility scale solar projects?
Absolutely. So just to unpack that, for if that was too fast for anybody here. So those not in the solar class, Bloomberg New Energy, working very hard in this area, doing forecasts, forecasts that we won't necessarily get to $1 a watt, but that $1.45 a watt is, and from the estimates that we do, I think that's entirely possible. In fact, there is a certain company located near Stanford, a very high quality PV company with a very strong Stanford connection, that thinks they will not get to $1 a watt, but they will get very close well before that date. And I think those numbers look very, very, very doable. So whether $1 a watt changes the world or not, I'm not clear, but I think that this $1.45 a watt is well within reach. Looks like, Gene, you've got a...
I'm not seeing the effect of quality.
Of quality.
Quality is very important. Becca Jones, my student, went to China. He saw that small systems would be very desirable. But the problem was when the battery broke, or when the light broke or something, they could not replace it.
Yeah.
And I think many of these things which we do with sophisticated methods will have a bad press when they don't work.
Yeah.
So in my case, I have in Berkeley a solar system, 2.4 megawatts.
Kilowatts, I hope. Well, actually, I don't hope, but I suspect, right? Yeah.
The panels are 25 years warranty. And what went out was the inverter. In 3 years, the inverter went out. Now, that's bad practice.
Yeah.
I think we should put the line in extra in the bank, quality control.
Yeah.
It should be like research efforts. We should look back and say, what have these guys done? How to use it? Or are they just promising stuff?
Yeah.
So where is this?
Yeah.
Where is the quality?
Yeah. So this is actually why I was pleased that you highlighted the D-Light case, because the one lantern, again, I'm worried about its high selling rate, is in fact the only one in last year's round that was, the others were conditionally approved, go back, work on problems of the cells. This one was rejected. And yet, it's the fastest selling one. The reason why I sort of highlighted and skimmed over this case here, because some people in the room have already heard it, is that this story, again, for a larger system than the ones we're talking about here with these very small lanterns, is an interesting, very practical case of that. Because the backstory for these amorphous panels that were being sold in Kenya, for those who haven't heard this from me 6 times, and I apologize for those who have, is that these amorphous panels, not only do they degrade after they get exposed to light, the so-called stable-Wronski effect that, of course, you guys studied in class, right? Okay, there's one. Okay, good. All right. So these panels typically degrade but then stabilize at about 20% less than their rated out of the box number. So you have a 100-watt panel, it's out in the sun, then you've got an 80-watt panel, and that's still fine, but of course most people were selling it as 100 watts. Well, it makes a big difference when the panel is 14 watts if you're losing 20% of that. And what it meant then was there was this huge uncertainty. Some people were rating it out of the box. Some people were rating it after it was light soaked and annealed a couple months later when it stabilized at a lower level. And some people were taking advantage of exactly what Professor Haller is mentioning, and that is that in this kind of wild west of these different types of lanterns, you could sell all kinds of junk. And in fact, what happened was one particular company was selling particularly egregious junk in Kenya. Their panels weren't stabilizing 20% down, they were stabilizing 60% down. So we went through a campaign to test all the panels. We drove around rural Kenya, we checked in shops, we would test panels out, find out how long they'd been on the roof, etc. And we then provided that information back to the manufacturers. The manufacturers of good quality panels started putting bumper stickers on their car. This is actually the bumper sticker. This company, Free Energy Europe, said, best tested in Kenya. Right? We did the testing, right? This was them highlighting, oh yeah, this lab at Berkeley said we were high quality. The other end of the spectrum, and theirs were very good. They were at 94 or 95% of rated output years later. So they were really behaving well. The bad ones were terrible. And the company that made the bad panels, they didn't put bumper stickers out, they sued me. All right? So what happened was they sued me, they sent me more panels, we tested them, we sent the results back to them, we published the results in the Kenyan newspapers. They didn't like that so much. They then left the market. 3 years later, they came back with a panel that's now in the high quality group. So this is that results in 1999. This is the high quality panel at 90 some odd % of its rated output. This is another panel that's pretty good. This is the bad guys that left the market. These guys then came back 5 years later with one of the best panels. And now there's a new company, and they're the bad actor, and they are as Professor Haller says, they're a Chinese company. I'm hoping they're going to sue my student, not me. But this, what you're highlighting, this need for quality control and testing, is actually what this Lighting Africa program has been about. And we will find out. I'm a little worried to hear, because I've not heard this before, that the one we rejected is the best seller. And it's not actually the cheapest. There's a couple others that are even cheaper, but it is at the low cost end of the story. So you're right. If part of the process of kind of bringing research on solar and other technologies and getting, what's the value of the dialogue between researchers on solar and business world on solar, hopefully it's being more efficient about promoting the product, but it's also about some accountability, because companies that are out there and are able to find them, we could find the good and the bad actors here, that there's a level of feedback that dialogue between academia and business could bring to the story. We don't know yet what's going to happen on the lanterns. That was certainly the intent of this Lighting Africa program, and I guess it's up to you to see if that pans out. But that was certainly the lesson that this current program learned from the effort that we did in the 80s. And so, the story isn't done yet, but that was exactly the intent.
Take one more.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit more about the costs of these devices, especially in the poorest regions of the world? I mean, my sense is what type of household penetration are you at? Do you feel like it's actually economically feasible?
Yeah. So, great question. If we go all the way back to the cook stove, I won't flash the slides. If we go all the way back to the cook stove story, when the first cook stoves went into the market, traditionally the simplest stove, of course, was 3 stones, so it cost nothing. But the simplest, I will go back to the slide, I can't resist. Sorry. But if you look at the, kind of the simplest stove, a metal stove, that would be our equivalent $2. You go to the more efficient stove, they were initially about $30. Their costs came down quite rapidly. They are now
not that much more. They're about 50% more than these were in equivalent terms. And of course, the amount of fuel they save will allow you to say, if you did the math that way, if you bought this on savings, these stoves will pay back their investment in the order of months. Now, $2 or $3 is still a big deal for people earning $1 a day. And so the question is, not only for stoves, but also for the lanterns, what do you do? So what we have now seen is that in the places where there's been kind of enough background work in terms of examining the stoves, making sure that they really work in local conditions, lots and lots of work, same as the lanterns. People are now selling these technologies with zero upfront payment. So we have examples of communities where the cook stove vendor or the photovoltaic vendor comes around, and because you're known in that area, you receive it no upfront cost, and then you pay back because the person comes through every week. And it does not go on everywhere. In places with huge migrant populations, that's not going to work well. But in more settled areas, we're seeing examples of the reverse. And if this pays you back on the order of a few months, the lanterns pay you back in a few months. And I want to just put that, do a footnote on that, because when I say pay you back, right, the classic economic story is you have the solar lantern, you're no longer buying kerosene. So if you said we're not going to buy kerosene, and we're going to use the solar, we would therefore save, and you pay back in the order of, your cheapest ones are on the order of a month, right? But that's if you buy. Right? What you're getting at is the story that, well, that's fine if you assume you have money and you pay for it or not. In some cases, you just don't have lighting. And so while we make these nice arguments about these least cost curves, that's if you have the money to buy it at all. And that is not true in other communities. So this is a evolving part of the process. My argument at the bank has been, we spent $44 billion. I think we can subsidize a fair amount of those first costs, those verification programs to get these technologies out. So story is not yet done, but I mean, these technologies are being bought at the so-called bottom